Hello, and welcome to the North Coast Journal Preview, where we take a look at the stories being covered in the current edition of the North Coast Journal. I'm your host, Dave Frank, and I'm joined today by Thad Greenson, news editor, and Jennifer Fumiko Cahill, arts and features editor at the North Coast Journal. Welcome, guys.
Hey, Dave.
Hey, Dave. How you doing?
Pretty good. Hopefully you guys are staying warm and dry and away from fallen trees and all sorts of madness going on out there.
Not taking any neighborhood walks today. Staying indoors.
That's good to hear.
It's one of the benefits of being an indoor plant.
There you go. Yeah, there's there. You got to see the silver lining in all of it. There's water. That's one silver lining. We're getting some water and snowpack.
Indeed.
But on that note, why don't we talk about? Dad, let's dive in. What is on the cover of this week's North Coast Journal?
Yeah, Dave, this week we have a really, really good story from our assistant editor, Kimberly Weir, or digital editor, Kimberly Weir, following up on some reporting she did a handful of years ago about the plight of the red abalone in Humboldt County. So I think last we reported on this, the Fish and Game Commission had instituted a 5-year closure of the recreational abalone fishing season. And there was, people were kind of up in arms about it at the time, but the commission really felt like the kind of a perfect storm of factors had so imperiled red abalone populations that the closure was kind of the only way to allow those the species really to get regain a foothold and kind of rebound. So she returned to the topic, and the news is not great.
Yeah, there's a lot in there. I know we say this often, but I do recommend folks check it out for themselves because there's so much in there. But this is like a snapshot of both the science and the ecosystem, what's going on off the coast, but also community involvement, public policy planning for the future on how to adapt and figure out a longer term solution. So just to get things started, Kimberly mentioned that there are people in our community who are working on this, and that they've made some observations about this, how we could perhaps intervene. So could you tell us a little bit, like what's the problem we're facing, the short version, I guess, and then also what are people considering? Who's taking a look at it, and what are people considering as a way to intervene?
Yeah, so the problem is complex in and of itself. That we've had kind of a series of events on the North Coast that have led to the situation now where red abalone are so imperiled. But so I guess the very short of it is we've had some warm water events, and that contributed to a sea star wasting disease that kind of is a little bit of a mystery exactly why it happened, but locally and across the entire North Coast, sea stars began dying off at a really alarming rate, and so that's obviously an issue in and of itself, but sea stars were the primary predator of purple sea urchins. And so without their primary predator kind of cleaned out, these purple sea urchin populations exploded and just devastated bulb kelp forests along the coast. And bulb kelp forests serve a whole variety of purposes, but they're also, a primary food source for red abalone. And so red abalone started starving and dying off. And red abalone are both very slow to mature, but then they also need kind of population density in order to reproduce. And so not only was the population kind of decimated, but it's having a really hard time rebounding. So that's like the really short nutshell version of what's caused the problem. And there's a whole variety of potential solutions that folks are looking at. The first and foremost is that probably we are not going to see a recreational abalone fishery on the North Coast for at least a decade. The Fish and Game Commission has been in the process for quite some time now trying to kind of formulate new rules for recreational abalone fishing, and have basically kind of thrown their hands up and said it doesn't really matter. Let's just slow roll these rules because we're not going to have any fishing season for a long time at this point. But but really kind of more, aggressive intervention strategies are needed and are being considered. And so that includes everything from like going in and replanting bull kelp forests. So Cal Poly Humboldt has a seaweed farm or kelp farm in Humboldt Bay that it was actually growing different types of kelp for different reasons, and some bull kelp started growing in their planting lines, and they decided to kind of let that go, and they're going to now raise bull kelp with the idea of replanting it out into natural ocean environment with the hope that these kelp forests will kind of take hold and grow. And then, so that's one intervention strategy. Another is that's been tried south of us, up in the Mendocino coast, is having dive teams go and aggressively cull purple urchin populations down to, I think it was 2 per square meter or something like that. But so basically going and canvassing, the sea floor off the coast and just like by hand pulling out purple urchins until there's only, no more than 2 per square meter to try to, again, give the bull kelp a chance to grow, because these urchins are so aggressive at eating young bull kelp and keeping it from growing up.
God knows this is the hill I will die on. I'm told they're delicious.
Oh my goodness. Yeah.
And that perhaps we can eat our way out of this disaster.
Well, I think maybe you need to start a PR campaign on that front, because one of the strategies Fish and Game Commission had tried previously is lifting all limits on harvests for purple urchins. And so I think I don't know if that's still in place, so check your Fish and Game regulations before going out and doing this. But previously they had said like, an all-you-can-eat buffet of purple urchins is open. And unfortunately it wasn't that successful, because apparently they're really hard to not harvest, but really hard to clean and get to that little bit of meat in the middle of them. But so in addition to culling purple urchin populations, there is also an effort underway at the University of Washington to breed and raise sea stars, especially the sunflower sea star, in laboratories, with the ultimate hope of reintroducing those lab-born sea stars into the wild, so that that population will gain a foothold and hopefully help cull the purple urchin populations a little bit more naturally. So efforts on kind of a whole variety of fronts, and people looking at this from a whole variety of angles, and including just researchers trying to figure out more data as far as what red populations are doing, and why they're rebounding a little bit more successfully in some areas as opposed to others.
Thanks, that big time. I know there's a lot more in the article, but that last piece of trying to like target, hyper focus the targeting of resources that's one way that they think that they'll sort of get some traction. And also that part of that is studying the impact of climate change on the sea temperature and salinity and freshwater river mouths, and et cetera. So there's this there's a perfect storm against the health of the ecosystem, but there are forces aligned to try to figure out the best mitigation steps. So there's a lot more to follow. Thanks for covering this.
Yeah, and I'd again just encourage everybody to read the story. It's a really fascinating story that Kim put together that is just really densely packed with information.
And you're going to love kelp afterwards. You're going to think highly of kelp.
Absolutely.
Also delicious.
Nice.
Redwood forests of the sea.
Dad, why don't we change gears? What else are you covering this week on the news beat?
Yeah, we also have a really interesting views piece, a column by Mark Larson, who folks will remember as the local freelance photographer who did a year retrospective for us a week or so back, and is a retired Cal Poly Humboldt professor of journalism. He wrote about kind of his experience of looking back at KHSU and the demise of KHSU a couple of years ago. KHSU as we used to know it, the station still exists, and kind of reflecting that it once would have been his go-to source for earthquake news or for any local disaster news. And he was kind of lamenting that in the wake of the December 20th quake, it never occurred to him to turn on KHSU to see what was happening, because it has virtually no local programming nowadays. So he attended a couple a couple Zoom informational conferences or meetings with the folks running KHSU currently, who are out of Cap Radio and I'm blanking on the other station, but out of the Sacramento area, basically, and are making the programming decisions locally. And basically what they reported at those meetings is that there is an interest in kind of building up some local programming for KHSU. But that resources are an issue, and that in order to do that, the university needs to pledge resources to staff the station locally, both with folks who will provide programming, but then there's also a component that they want to provide hands-on experience for students, but that can only happen with staff or faculty mentorship at the station, and so far the university hasn't done that.
Sounded from the article like there's a bare bones crew that's basically just keeping the transmitter running, and that they have these aspirations to make some changes, but in the meantime, it's really just national news with a regional, spectrum, regional vantage point. But so in the piece, it talks about like what's missing, this loss. Can you speak a little bit to what the position of KHSU is about their local, programming and contribution?
Yeah, I mean, I think that currently they have local news updates in the afternoon, but they're really short, kind of 5-minute updates with the weather and the basic headlines. And I think that I don't know. I personally was reminded of the importance of local radio as a medium in the aftermath of the quake. There's nothing, especially when there's a disaster that impacts connectivity and internet connections and cell phone connections. There's nothing that really fills that same void as local radio. And Lauren Schmidt, the news director down at KMUD, did an awesome job of getting on the air right in the aftermath of the quake and kind of providing information in real time as they could gather it. And that is very much a function that KHSU used to provide in times of local emergency. And with a regional approach, there's no way to really do that. You need local people on the ground who are going to be in the station, who are going to be fielding calls, who are going to be actively gathering information and disseminating it to listeners in real time.
Well, thanks for covering that. I think there's a lot in there for folks to check out. I think you used the word lament. I feel like it was in the air. It is a lament for what was lost by the community and what does not seem to be on the horizon in the near term. I know we're sorry, go ahead.
I think that the answer that Mark kind of points to is that if folks do want to see that built back up, that it's really up to the university to put resources into the station. And so if folks want to see that, if they share Mark's lament, then they should be in contact with Cal Poly administration about making that a funding priority. Right on.
I know we have limited time. There's one more story that you're covering you'd like to mention. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that one?
Yeah. I think folks, who pay attention to the local news might have caught a headline last week. I think the Times Standard was the first to break the story that a dead body had been found at the Samoa recycling facility, and that Eureka Police Department had responded and launched an investigation. And we had been intent on following up on that since that initial report. And we posted yesterday a story that is really bare bones, unfortunately, because the Eureka Police Department has just been really recalcitrant about releasing any detailed information about what happened. But what we know is that a 57-year-old woman, Justine Green, was the woman whose body was found out there on January 5th, I believe. What we understand, and again, this is limited, is that it seems she was sheltering amid the storm that came in with really high winds and lots of rain. She was sheltering in a commercial recycling dumpster when it was picked up by a Recology hauling truck. And from the the cause of death from the coroner, it seems that she didn't die due to exposure or some other natural issue, that she died due to asphyxiation from essentially being compression on her chest. And so what we've been able to put together with, again, very little information from authorities is that it seems she was sheltering there and was killed, and the truck was dumped into, or the dumpster was dumped into the hauling truck. And so I think it's just important. It's obviously a tragic situation, and I think it's important, for us to get as much information about it as possible, because it raises some questions about shelter options available locally and why someone would take the extreme measure of sheltering in a dumpster as opposed to going to a variety of local shelter options that are in place. Our story talks a tiny bit about what some of those barriers are for some folks in seeking shelter.
And in the article, you point out what these options are, how to get in touch with folks, and you got a comment from the city manager who said that, from their perspective, there are options available to people. They basically want to remind folks. Any last thoughts on this before we wrap up on your side of the house?
I just think, from all accounts, there were options available, and there were some outreach efforts made to Justine Green. To me, I think that it should be a wake-up call for us as a community that maybe it's time to reevaluate our shelter options and whether they provide a welcoming space for everybody, and our outreach efforts if they were so apparently so unsuccessful in this case.
Well, thank you so much for this coverage. Extreme weather has extreme consequences, and we'll continue to follow the story.
Yeah, thanks, Dave.
Jen, how about you? What is going on the Arts and Features beat this week?
Well, the weather part of it continues because, as you know, in Trinidad and the outlying areas, the unincorporated areas in that area, the area, lots of people have lost their power. The projected, did we say the 13th? Friday the 13th,
January 13th, yeah, is
when PG&E is projecting they will have power back on Friday the 13th. Wow. What could go wrong? Our, intrepid local organizations have stepped up to help out. As you recall, when the first quake hit in Rio Del, lots of people lost water, power, etc. And World Central Kitchen showed up and deployed local food trucks to help feed people in Rio Del, give them hot meals, because food trucks, of course, have their own electricity, their own water supply, and they're ready to go to mobilize and show up somewhere and start feeding people immediately. So the World Central Kitchen people left just before the second, the big aftershock on January 1st. And local organizations, including Humboldt Made, the Humboldt Community Organizations Active in Disaster, and they got some grant money through the Humboldt Area Foundation and the Wild Rivers Community Foundation. And with that emergency grant money, they continued the service in Rio Del using the same World Central Kitchen model of basically paying a flat per meal fee to the people operating trucks and just keeping it going for as long as it's needed and feeding people who pull up to relief centers. So once the power went out in Trinidad and, they lost power for several days, some of the people in downtown Trinidad have got their power back, but in outlying areas, of course, it's slower. The city manager there, what is his first name? I'm sorry, it's Eli. Mr. Naffa. What is it?
Eli Naffa.
Eli Naffa, whose name I kind of love. Eli Naffa said to himself, well, how do we get the same service that Rio Del was doing up here? Could we do something like that for residents who can't get a hot meal? He made some calls and some people were working on it. And what eventually happened is that Humboldt Made organized the same effort that they were doing basically in Rio Del in Trinidad. So now there's two cities receiving aid, and the Trinidad effort seems to be moving northward as power is being restored in some areas, and they're already delivering meals or having people drive in and pick up meals for places like Big Lagoon, and they're just outlying areas are hit so much harder. So they may be moving more north in the coming days, finally winding up in Oric, where lots of people need help. The fella who is coordinating much of this is Nick Bound-Crawford of Humboldt Made, and he's also part of a food access group within the Humboldt community organizations active in disaster. And he's been kind of contacting food trucks, getting some of the same people back in the game. I spoke with somebody from Los Giles Taqueria truck, and they were getting ready to make 700 meals, and one of the owners was staying, Esmeralda Hernandez was staying back at the Arcata Food Works where they do all their prep and making more food, because that was I spoke to her on the first day of the Trinidad effort, and they weren't sure how many people would be showing up. So they were kind of ready to do more. And they've been driving back and forth between Trinidad and Rio Del. And a number of other trucks have been doing that. Pupuseria San Miguel has been providing more food. The one bright spot in disaster, right? You could get a pupusa. It's been really lovely to see all these people working so hard, and all the people that I've talked to in all the trucks, whether it's like Taste of BIM or, everyone has just said the same thing, which is that, yes, they are being paid and they're happy they're not losing money on this, but they are not in it for the money. They are really trying to help. And it's been really lovely to see how this initial move that World Central Kitchen brought might be something that we see happening in Humboldt in the future as things happen, because it doesn't seem like extreme weather is going away. It doesn't seem like the tectonic plates are going to just finally chill. And, we always have people in need in Humboldt. So it's really great to see that this wasn't just a one-off, and that we can continue using a model that really works.
Yeah, this is awesome. And there's a public-private element to it where, like in Trinidad, they were getting flyers out to people to let them know the food was available, and people were running food to remote areas and neighbors. This is like you said, the silver lining here in all this.
Yeah, it's really good to see people helping each other.
Fantastic. I know we have very limited time, but there's another story you got going on. Why don't you tell us a little bit about it?
You have a few more days until the 22nd, I believe, to go and see this really phenomenal exhibit of quilts. If you are not a quilt person, do not say no to the quilts just because you are not a quilt person, because these quilts are wild. The artist, Katie Pasquini Masopust, I believe that's how you say it. I could be wrong. Andrea Stuckey this week went and spoke to her and looked at her work at the Morris Graves Museum, and it is very cool. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking quilts, okay, squares, triangles, etc., patterns, always very cool. But these are trippy quilts that look like paintings. The artist is, in fact, a painter by first training and learned quilting later on and applied some of those same techniques to her work. And as you stand back from it, there's one that I would have sworn is a watercolor. And then as you get closer, you see the stitching and the patches, and it's wild. You see like how color fades out on the edge of a pool of paint replicated in fabric. And there's another one that's really wild that looks like red paint splashed, and it truly looks like splashes. And as you get closer, you see the texture, and it really changes, right? You're still seeing composition, you're still seeing the use of color and to some extent texture that you would see in painting. But then upon closer inspection, the process, the texture, the feel of it, and the context of it is completely different, and it's absolutely worth seeing.
It seems really cool. Like one of the quotes in the article says, "Oh, I thought it was a painting," which I think is telling. And also, folks used to have for centuries tapestries on their walls. So it's, textiles are, a home decor art form of par excellence. And this is a good example right here in our own community.
Yeah, I'm bringing tapestries back.
Nice.
Let's do tapestries in my foreboding castle, and maybe some of these as well. It's really beautiful, and I think it's a different look at a very traditional art form.
Yeah, it's really neat. When did you say people have the window to go check it out in person?
That is through January 22nd.
All right, so there's still time. Very cool. Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Jen. This was really cool, checking in with you and seeing what's going on, getting us the heads up on where we can go and see art and culture in our own community. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
North Coast Journal is available on sorry. That's about all the time that we have this week. Thad, Jennifer, thank you so much. We appreciate you both.
Thanks.
Thanks for having us.
North Coast Journal is available on newsstands now. Pick one up, stay informed. Also available online 24/7, so you can check them out anytime. Thank you out there for listening, and take care till we check in again next week. Bye, guys.